So since I think, I don't know whether the picture that Vrinda posts is actually exactly hopeful, but it is not hopeless. In that sustained interventions on various matters have at least split the judgments, have created, but the home, Nivi, remains something of a kernel, which to be able to regulate the home, where, as Jayati points out, relations of affect and love tie you into not being a striking mother, tie you into not resisting, that you can't walk off if nobody's changing the nappies, you'll just have to change it yourself. And the space for the intervention of law to regulate home, where one should be able to fight an individual battle, how can that space possibly open up in the home? That is, in the space where the law will continue to not have to intervene. How do we change our homes?
Well, I wouldn't want that. I wouldn't, and I think many feminists would correctly not be comfortable with the law regulating the home, because the law is an instrument which is a blunt instrument, and very fine lawyers can work on it, but usually when there's a law, it's a blunt instrument. And I believe that many feminists have recognized, so some of you may be familiar with Graham Gibson, J.K. Graham Gibson, which are two feminist writers who wrote under one name. They hyphenated their surnames and they wrote as J.K. Graham Gibson. One of them passed away a few years ago. But J.K. Graham Gibson, writing about capitalism, but they use feminism as an analogy where without a revolution, without a one-moment transformation, there have been such granular day-to-day changes that, for example, Vrinda said when she started there were so many women lawyers, and now there are many more. All of us have come from homes where we have seen, and especially if you've reached the university, you've come from homes where you've seen the growing and the changes to the patriarchal rules of the home. So I believe that the home will be transformed from inside, from daughters and sons and children of any gender, asking these questions, changing the sexual division of labor. So every day is a revolution if you're a feminist, in a way. So when you have, if you have a son asking his father, why don't you do X work today? That's a moment of rebellion. So I imagine and I see homes as being, and they're already transformed. This is not some kind of utopian vision. Right now there are young people and middle-aged people living in families which are not heterosexual and patriarchal. There are groups and communities, and there are queer collectives and all kinds of ways in which people are living, which is already transforming the home. And of course what I've said is kind of about urban middle classes, but even among working class people, we don't, there's work on it, but we don't encounter the different ways. But every time a woman walks out on an alcoholic husband, every time, and those alcoholic husbands are very much part of the urban middle class home too. So I'm saying that there is a way in which families are changing, but the violence of compulsory marriage is there. It hangs like a sword over, and what that sword does is it basically disables women from being prepared for anything but marriage, and especially the poorer you are. So they will work, they will be employed, they will be wage labor, but they have to be married, and then they are stuck. So I think there's something about, we have to confront marriage, and the only way I can think of the law helping is by a ban on marriage, and see what happens. See what happens. What if you're not ever allowed to marry off your children? It's a nice fantasy. It's a nice fantasy to imagine.
It's interesting she says that at a time when there are petitions in the Supreme Court for same-sex marriage to be recognized. So it's a complicated space.
Yeah, so I was reminded, Nivi, when you're saying that things are changing and they will begin in the home. I think Vrinda's idea of the threshold is actually quite right. It's not just inside the home. It cannot happen just inside the home. You would only have the guts to do something inside the home if there are other things happening around you. And that's also true of, marriage. The weirdness of marriage is the persistence. I agree with you, but but I think that the persistence of marriage is not necessarily something that is only patriarchally driven. I mean, as she said. Right? At the moment I'm teaching in the US, and everybody who's gay or lesbian, everybody wants to be married, So there is something about that, notion of permanence or whatever, and of course they're not permanent, but the point is that you think for a while that it's permanent. So whatever it is, there's something in that. I think what you really have to get at, sorry to be so crudely economic and deterministic, but ultimately it's the division of labor that sucks. Right? That's really the critical thing. And the point is that marriages are determined based on that division of labor. And let me just remind all of us, because we keep forgetting it, it's not biological. The only thing you have to do as a woman is get pregnant, have the baby. Breastfeed for a while. Even that, by the way, historically has been outsourced. Right? Now you can outsource even having the baby. So let's remember that that's it. Everything else can be shared, can be done by others. And the fact that it's not, and that women end up persisting and thinking that that's basically our job, that's the thing that has to be changed. And that, of course, drives everything else, right? So, I think it is certainly marriage, the way it's dealt with, but marriage is part of a broader structure that is all about the control of women's labor. Yeah, reproductive and other labor. So,
any kind of feminist history or looking back at the past finds these moments either in writings or in people's lives of insurrections. So that the state that we live in is one which is always never a certainty in the favor of marriage. It is, I think, a particular fact of the effect of the last 2 or 3 centuries that the state has to respond to some questions that insurrections that the women and since we have a vast majority of people whose lives have not changed, and there are these little bubbles of insurrection. Does that, Vrinda, make you feel that it's okay for the state to make laws on what is the role of the state? Because I think I agree with Nivedita that the state is over-deterministic and it can intrude in every aspect of your life. We see what it can do. For example, the triple talaq law that has been passed that enables a woman bans an illegal practice, makes a practice illegal, but then creates a situation in which Muslim women are being asked to incarcerate Muslim men, and not only them, anybody can go and make a complaint. So that there is like a long arm of the law. So how do we then deal with this conundrum? What is the welfare state? So is the fact that work is unpaid? Do we want a recognition, Jayati, of women's labor in the home in terms of payment? And do we want then the fact that there has to be, we do not want laws that will allow the state to go deep into the home, taking Nivi's point in mind. So I have both of you, so Vrinda first.
Okay, so this is Nivi and my favorite conversation, which we've been having for last 2.5 decades. Neither of us have shifted our position. We are very persuasive, surely. Okay, so see, what does law do in a society and country like ours, where there is Khap Panchayat, there is caste, there is religion of all hues? It also sets a normative standard. The normative standard is not set in the family of what should be achieved. It's not as though any of us, at least I didn't, learn equality or respect for others in our families. These things we have to actually acquire outside our homes. So this is not part of our culture. So what is the norm? Who sets the normative standard? In our system, the law assumes that role. Why is beating your wife wrong? It wasn't wrong some decades, century ago. You only had to have a certain measure of the stick under English law. Secondly, if it's not as though I disagree that law is a blunt weapon or that the law will inherently be partisan towards those who are more powerful within the system. But if you look around, you will see that a lot of the groups, for instance, the Dalit activists have actually fought very hard to get amendments in the Prevention of Atrocities Act. Does it necessarily yield results? No, I think there is a dismal scorecard that emerges. So somewhere there is a gap which needs to be acknowledged, and we need to talk about systems and processes and accountability more. When I was saying that the criminal justice system is actually all about power to the state and controlling people in different ways as subjects, and the only place it's giving to women is, okay, you can make a complaint against the individual man, but the state is not ceding power. The state is only saying, I will now play arbiter between the individuals. The real push that needs to come is about holding the state accountable, and that accountability, in fact, there was some attempt made when some of us were engaged in a process of post the experience of both 1984 and 2002, the anti-Muslim violence in Gujarat, that we need a law that will create accountability of the state and its agents to protect particularly minorities from this kind of violence, whether perpetrated by mobs or indirectly by the state. And the reason why no government was willing to support that was because if you are in a democracy, and recently the Chief Justice of India famously said the Constitution is a feminist document. I think it needs a lot of unpacking, but that was his perspective. So if you do have a feminist document as the Constitution of India, then you will be required to make accountability the centerpiece of the criminal justice system, particularly state officials, etc. So that is really where we are struggling, and I think that's the part that we need to, when this government, for instance, famously says all colonial hangovers, laws, policies have to be shed. It's a very good thing. So what is the colonial hangover? It's the legal immunities given to people who today run the state. Let me give you a very small example. You cannot actually prosecute a public servant without getting permission, even if they murder, without getting permission from the state, from that very government. When the Constitution of India comes in, when we become independent, the only thing they change is they replace servants of the crown with public servants in the Indian Penal Code, but the legal immunities and privilege remain unchallenged. So that is the colonial past that we need to shed and create accountability mechanisms, because I do believe that given the stratification of our society and the kind of, we are not going to be able to negotiate and navigate this without external assistance, and to my mind the democratic state is meant precisely to do this, and it has to intervene, and that's the gap and the negotiation, not that it's happening anytime soon.
I want to ask you something. Sure. Which is that, I don't know whether this is the kind of thing Nivi also asks you in your 2.5 decade thing, but so you're right that you need that law. I will remind you that according to the latest survey, 69% of women think that a husband is justified in beating the wife if she doesn't cook properly and all that, right? But yeah, so in Assam now, all these people are being rounded up because they married girls who were below the legal age, right? Under POCSO. Of course, people are also mentioning that, you should have been doing this for people in Gujarat as well who married, when they were children. And so I'm just saying that there is a weaponization for sure, but I'm just saying that that kind of intervention, it can be misused so readily and so easily. So what's the way in which you kind of balance that?
See, the weaponization of law that you see in the triple talaq, which incidentally is the triple talaq was struck down by the court, not by any government, no matter what they say. And Muslim women went to court saying that it should be struck down, which was their right. What we are seeing in Assam is actually the pinnacle of the weaponization of laws and the rhetoric and the bogey of any state being there for welfare or securing rights of women and children. They have totally weaponized and used it to their end. Therefore, when I say whether it is sentencing, whether it is even what will be an offense and who will have the power to complain, that cannot be ceded to the state. You need to create offenses, but you don't need to keep giving. That power has to remain with the people who are affected. Why? Unfortunately, we each time cede power to the state alongside. And I think that's where I would make a distinction between what a women's rights intervention would be and a feminist intervention would be. And I think if the feminist articulation of violence against women has to today be very, very distinct from what every character, political party, particularly the ruling party, is talking about women, and the media is screaming about women. And that is about control of the woman. It's not about freedom for the woman. But yes, in Assam, what has happened is the weaponization of law by those in power. But isn't law the main terrain of negotiating power today? I mean, particularly as economists, I would like to understand from you. In fact, our lives are today regulated from the 90s. All aspects of our lives are regulated way more by law than they were before because the economic structure changed. There is no aspect of anybody's life today that is not regulated by some element of law. And that is a function of the nature of the economy. So you can't, it's about creating more and more space and taking that power. I'm not sure it's going to be wished away.
I think Nivi is anxious to.
Yeah, thank you for reading my anxious expression. No, I'm not going to, I just wanted to make 2 or 3 points from the discussion so far. And yes, this is very much the debate that Vrinda and I have, and we continue to be very good friends, which is that the way in which Jayati put it also, that there are other kinds of struggles are necessary, etc. So there is an issue with the law being the only space. Now, we know that feminist lawyers and feminist judicial practice is necessary and important, but there are other, I think, spaces. So I just want to pick up 2 or 3 issues that came up and they were sort of left trailing, and I really wanted to talk about it. Very quickly about payment and wages for housework. I thought I would just alert us all to that this is a debate of kind of the 70s, 80s in Western feminism, and it's not an idea that feminists eventually espoused, because the question becomes who pays the wages? Does the husband pay the wages? And if so, then the husband is your employer. And if it is the employer who has to pay the husband the wages for the wife, in other words, because the man's labor is dependent on invisible labor that has gone in, the reproductive labor that enables him to work the next day. So the employer should pay for that invisible labor. That's another possibility. But of course, that is not even a feasible scenario. If it were feasible, it completely concretizes the sexual division of labor. It makes the sexual division of labor natural, institutionalized, rather than saying let's break this up and let it not be there. About marriage, I did kind of frivolously say ban marriage, but it's not entirely frivolous, and I think the desire for marriage is because it is the only way in which you can say so and so can pull the plug on me if I'm dying, so and so can inherit my property, so and so can look after the child we adopted together. This is the only institution that permits it. So obviously people desire it. So there has to be a way in which we develop civil kinds of... See, the problem is, as Vrinda said, it's a problem that we are entirely legible to the state at all times. And the state is completely opaque to us. The RTI has gone and Aadhaar is in. Right? The RTI is practically dead, so we don't know anything about the state. And Aadhaar is 100% now. We have absolutely no other option but to have Aadhaar. Although it's not even, it's a private entity, UIAD. So marriage, it becomes important for this reason, and so we need to be thinking about, and of course within queer domains there are debates about this, but you can understand the desire for marriage. I doubt it's also partly, I think, permanence and so on, but partly because it's the only way in which you can actually be legible to the state in a society where if you're not legible to the state, you're penalized. So there has to be a way, in an anarchistic kind of way, in which we get over this. We go under it. How do we get under the radar? Our question should be, how do we get under the radar? How do we develop documents and legal things, to use a technical term, legal things, to enable our children to be looked after and our property to be whatever and all that. I wanted to say one thing about marital rape. Because this question of criminalizing triple talaq came up, and I'm opposed to criminalizing in principle, and criminalizing rape or criminalizing triple talaq, criminalizing marital rape or triple talaq. But it's interesting, as another lawyer pointed out, Malvika Rajkotia pointed out, that it's an interesting system in which a Muslim man can go to jail if he pronounces triple talaq, although that's banned already. But any man can rape his wife, and it's not a criminal offense. Now, yes, that's very striking, but I think marital rape should be a condition for divorce. It should be a civil issue, and I don't. So this is something that I think would come up, because why? What is it that the woman gets by putting the man in jail? She would be much better off getting a divorce and having decent alimony and maintenance for the children, and just getting the hell out of that violent situation. So there's that. And finally, just about age of marriage, this business about POCSO, and I think all of us, all feminists, have been very troubled by the continuous raising of the age of consent, because it sounds very progressive, but effectively it means that consensual sex is called rape if you are even 17 and so on. And there have been interesting and important studies of rape cases in the Delhi High Court, for example, by a journalist, Rukmini, I think, where she found that 75% of them, or a very large percentage, were actually situations of consensual sex between young people, which parents went to court to. So, it's the long arm of that patriarchal, heterosexual, violent family home that is just creeping into every space. And I think we have to think of going under the radar rather than more criminalizing.
I'm going to give it to you because I
This is not out of my control.
Okay. No, I have to say two things. So actually you have the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act, where women are going if there is sexual abuse, and the law recognizes sexual abuse by husband also. So yes, I think marital rape requires discussion, and we may actually agree on that. So I'm not sure we need to go under the radar. I would start doing things, dismantling the radar rather than going under the radar.
Okay, very quickly before Ayesha bashes us up, so on the issue of payment for housework. I mean, it's a very stupid idea, as Nivi has already emphasized, and for many, many different reasons. But what do you do then about unpaid care work in particular? So feminist economists have basically argued for what is called the 5 R's, okay? You recognize it, first of all. That is to say, how do you figure out how much is being done? You do time use surveys. And this is even one of the things the Secretary General has agreed to, that you get every country to do regular time use surveys so you know how much is paid work, how much is unpaid work, how much is social, relational and leisure time. Second, you having recognized it, you try and reduce as much as possible. So you reduce the things which are unnecessary unpaid work, whether it is through mechanization or through providing amenities, access to water, access to fuel, etc., you try and reduce. Third, you redistribute. You don't have to keep all of it in the home. So you redistribute between the home, the state, the private provider, the cooperatives, the community, and you redistribute within the home. Tougher call, we all know that, but as far as possible, you try and redistribute. Fourth, you reward the ones who are doing the paid care work, because one of the things about unpaid care work is that paid care workers therefore get massively underpaid. Because everyone thinks anyway it's done for free. Why do you want to pay an Asha? Why do you want to pay an Anganwadi worker? Why do they deserve a minimum wage? So reward the care workers as much as they are necessary for society. Value their work and reward them. And finally, represent them, give them a voice in the policies that affect them, including unpaid workers. In fact, the ILO has finally recognized that it has to include unpaid workers, mostly women, in their definition of workers so as to have a voice in the platforms or in the policies that affect them. So there are ways around it. You don't have to say, okay, we have to give it a monetary value. That's because we're so all imbued by capitalism that we think nothing has a value till it has a monetary value.
So this unfortunately has to be the last question that I asked. Let me assure you that I had sent all these ladies my 5 questions and I've actually never even managed to ask one of them. And I have been falsely accused, but this is what happens in Addas. So I think the last question I want to ask is about us, men and women here, because the one question you didn't answer, but you all did indirectly answer it, which was that feminism, a feminist take is not all about women. It's about the system. And speaking about the undocumented, the unrecognized, the unpaid, we speak of them as people, based on that radical idea that women are people too. But so I want to turn my final question, I want to talk about us being here in the university. And I think on this matter there is agreement, while there might not be agreement on that the protections that we've had in the university were hard fought. They were not regulated by law, but law was enabling. And I would like to definitely, I think there are many faculty in the room, so we will all remember the time when there was our gender sensitization committee against sexual harassment. We had fluid, open-ended definitions of what sexual harassment was, of how procedure to actually inquire and to do either punitive action or reformation in the process, because we are, after all, nobody comes to us sui generis. Everybody's been through the grinder, the organ grinder that produces men and women. We lost that in 2017. There were many internal reasons why we lost it. But just as that there were external reasons why we could talk about an anti-sexual harassment committee back in 1997, and this Ms. Grover is one of the people who helped us frame rules that actually we felt that university communities could own. And they were not mandated by law, but we framed them anyway. And in 2017, when we lost the GS cash. We lost it not, we lost it, and so did not alone. In fact, today, the atmosphere across the country is that actually there's no sexual harassment anymore. It's gone. It's finished. I mean, ever since there was a momentous election, sexual harassment unelected itself, right? And so it lost power. So there are no functioning anti-sexual harassment committees anymore. So whether this is mandated from the larger debate, the fact that here, at least, and in Delhi University, and in many other institutions, that these moments came and then they all departed simultaneously. And of course we want to talk about, there is of course a political context when it becomes possible. But my final question is, how was the university? Was it institutions like this? Like today, right now, Jayati was just talking about, we had a creche in our university for where faculty's children, PhD scholars' children, workers' children were all ran a creche. All of that has gone. So is this moment that we are in 2017, what does a university do? What is the point of the discussion we are having? What is, when we are faced with external and internal challenges like this? So, very briefly, in 3 minutes each.
She goes first.
Is it as bleak and hopeless? 2, it's not about getting those institutions back or whatever. I think that would be too long a discussion. But what does a university do right now? Do we just keep quiet that we have lost these institutions? Do we protest? Or are there more things that we can do meaningfully? Nivi first, then Vrinda, then Jayati.
Well, of course, we face enormous challenges. What is it? Sorry? Should I keep speaking?
Yes.
Okay, so we do face enormous challenges, and the biggest weapon against the university system is the new education policy, the national education policy, which is determined to end...
They can't hear you, hang on.
They can't hear you.
Okay, now?
Go ahead.
Okay, so the biggest weapon against the university system is public university. Against the public university is the NEP. And the NEP is intended to end access to education. It is intended to end diversity. It is diversity of thought. That's a long story. We don't have time to discuss the NEP. Now, we are faced with that. But when you say, and it's an important question to ask, what is the point of this discussion? I do believe that if it's a long struggle, and it may be a long struggle, a longer struggle than we thought when we started out in 2014, then that long struggle will be waged by the survival of ideas. If the ideas and the ideals of the public university survive, then the vast majority of people in this room who are dark-haired and below 30, there are ideas that will be taken forward, and there will be a memory. So I just want to actually end it. I suddenly remembered this very stark line from Capital in which Marx says that by the 18th century the memory of the relationship between the peasantry and the land had vanished. So the point of such discussions is that the memory should not vanish. And if it's a long struggle, so be it.
So actually what Nivi is pointing us towards is what is being practiced not since 2014 but for long. Maybe we didn't pay adequate attention to things that were happening outside our lives, outside our own states. Is the politics of erasure. And that is a politics that the Indian state has practiced in different parts of the country. It has now come to all of us.
That's true.
So the issue, if to go back to the specific issue of sexual harassment and the struggles that actually gave rise to that kind of understanding and some kind of mechanisms, legal mechanisms to help us redress and address these situations, and actually provided a focal point of a very important conversation. It was not just about addressing the individual complaint, as people like Ayesha and many others sitting here who've been engaged in this for very, very long, very intensely. It was about providing a conversation where, from the classroom to the residence to everywhere else, the issue of dignity of women is central and is the core of sexual harassment, whether it is the wrestlers who are talking or anyone else. And as Nivi says, we therefore cannot abandon it. The state has dismantled all enabling processes, whether outside or within universities or any other internal mechanisms. I do, however, want to point that it's not a period of despair, because the issue is arising over and over again in many, many spaces. What is that sexual harassment is a wrong is today common sense. And that is a common sense that now no longer can be erased even by the state powers. There is a very interesting agreement that was That was a very interesting agreement, and you can Google. And in fact, do not read out such long series and take up our time. Tell people what our names are. If they like what we said, they'll Google us and find out. So it has some uses. Please Google and read about the Dindigul Trade Union Agreement of 2022. Dindigul being a place in Tamil Nadu. Right? Where the death of, in a textile garment factory, the repeated sexual harassment and the death of a Dalit woman worker, a factory that supplies to H&M, led to the trade union leading a huge battle, and H&M then signing agreements across the board, which is called the Dindigul Trade Union Agreement against gender-based harassment or sexual harassment. Is an extraordinary achievement in these times. And I really think we need to look at those victories, that it's an amazing victory.
Yeah, just final point. I mean, it is about recovering the past, it is about forging a future, and it's really meetings like this that enable you to think something through, because finally, a lot of sexual harassment, yes, it's about dignity, but it's also about power. It's about relational power. And recognizing that in your own lives, in all the circumstances around you, is a huge step forward. So even before you start campaigning, which you don't have to do, to get those structures back in place, that recognition itself is an enabling thing.
All right, so now the floor is open for questions. Are we going to pass around the mic or?
Oh, they have questions.
Oh my God, they already have